How can a state that gets between 48 and 60 inches of rain on average during a year have a water supply problem? I mean, that is a perplexing question. But when you look at our water management districts and the systems that they live with, especially the three that manage the districts here in the peninsula, you determine that our systems were designed primarily as a drainage system to rapidly move water from the interior part of the state to the coastal areas and to the estuaries, which we now find causes degradation to the estuaries when the water is discharged. And our water management districts have very limited management opportunities to manage that water. Most of our potable water is drawn from groundwater supply. And as we're learning, it's not a sustainable source. Certainly won't meet the needs of the future, and frankly, we're finding that it doesn't necessarily meet the needs of the present. But these are exciting times for water and water issues and those of us who work in water. We have the upcoming legislative session that Representative Chris Foley has dubbed the session for water. We have Amendment 1 that just passed, and regardless of whether you agree or disagree that we should be making these types of legislative decisions through our amendment process, it's here, and it passed 3-1, and so we have something that we're going to have to learn to work with. We have many water supply planning efforts underway, and here in Central Florida we have a very unique supply planning effort with the Central Florida Water Initiative, whereby the three water management districts that divide Central Florida up like a big pizza are actually working together to develop water supply plan and to come up with a methodology to meet the future needs of this area. We have controversy dealing with our springs and the flows and the minimum flows and levels for other water bodies associated with our springs. And then we have the ever-present Kissimmee River Basin, Lake Okeechobee, Everglades, and discharge to the estuaries issues that we deal with, seems like, every year. Very excited about the panel of experts we've been able to pull together for this presentation. And how we're going to do this, I've asked each gentleman to address a couple of these issues in their presentation. Each one will take about 15 minutes, and then we'll allow the other panel members to weigh in if they have comments on those issues before we segue to the next presentation. And then after all three are done, we're going to open it up for questions and answer at the end, and we'll leave about 10-15 minutes at the end of the program. Leading off our presentation is Hans Tanzer. Hans is the Executive Director of St. Johns River Water Management District. Before that, he was the Director of the General Counsel's Office, and before that, he was a Governing Board member. And before that, Hans and I share in common, he's a tax attorney. Both of us active in the tax section of the Florida Bar, sort of unique background to work your way into water. Hans received his law degree from the University of Florida. He's also a CPA, and he was Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Internal Revenue Service. Hi, I'm from the IRS, I'm here to help you. Before going into private practice, and he's also served on a number of corporate boards and been involved as, I think, a bit of a serial entrepreneur. He's served on the University of Florida Foundation, the Conservation Trust of Florida, and previously chaired the Jacksonville Zoological Society. He's also been a commissioner of the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission, and it's safe to say is a gentleman farmer in the Ocala area. Following Hans will be Rich Budell. Rich is the Director of Office of Agricultural Water Policy for FDACS. He joined FDACS back in 1985, so he's seen an awful lot of things transpire over his years up in Tallahassee. He oversees the statewide programs promoting implementation of the agricultural BMPs addressing water quality and conservation. He also is very involved with regional water supply planning efforts, assessing the future water needs and representing FDACS in that process. And he also recently completed a service on the National Academy of Sciences Committee evaluating the nutrient reduction strategies for the Chesapeake Bay. His background and his degrees, first he went to, his BS was from where they play Smurf football, Boise State, with the blue field. And he has his master's degree from Florida State University. Batting cleanup will be Ernie Barnett. Ernie is the Executive Director of the Florida Land Council, which is an association that represents large landowners and represents approximately 3 million acres of land in the state of Florida, and is designed to protect the asset values of its membership landholders. He has been involved with just about every form of water legislation that's come through the state in the past 30 years, and is the director of the Waterland Advisory, Inc. environmental consulting firm. Before joining the Land Council, he was also the interim director of the South Florida Water Management District, and was very involved with the development of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. His background is he has a master's from the University of Florida in environmental engineering. He has a master's in biology and a bachelor and a BS from University of West Florida. So kicking it off will be Hans. Hans is going to talk to us about some of the coordinating efforts that the water management districts are doing on regional water supply planning, and including the Central Florida Water Initiative. And it's also going to discuss some of the issues having to do with the springs and the MFLs. Hans?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. And Mike and I go a long way back, and it's interesting how the path of life takes you to places that you don't always predict. And this particular chapter in my book of life is very meaningful, and it's an opportunity to make a difference before you die, I hope. And the difference is to help assure sustainable quantities of water for future generations of Floridians, all users. And it's a major task, and I'm going to give you a big picture about it, and then we'll start drilling down. But the big picture helps understand what is involved in the individual components. One of the major missions of a water management district is to plan for the future, to plan for adequate quantities of water to be available for all users. All users include people, includes agriculture, includes industry, includes commerce. It's all users. And then, at the same time, assure that adequate quantities are allocated to Mother Nature so we can protect the natural resources. This is statutory. It's part of our mission. It is getting tougher. And so the plan, which is not self-executing, is what starts that process. I'm going to talk about the components of a plan. Mike also alluded to, I think, some interesting kind of trivia. What state is number one in rainfall? I bet no one has any idea. Hawaii, all right. And 2, 3, and 4, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Number 5, Florida, average 51 inches. First half of the last century was all about draining the swamp. Remember the jokes, draining the swamp? And they did a good job of draining the swamp. And so we're now about reversing that, and we're going to talk about that, and trying to keep some of that rainwater here available to be a potential water supply. And so in doing our planning, the primary focus is to first try to ascertain what are water resources available, i.e. groundwater, and potential other sources, so that tapping those sources doesn't create adverse harm that's unacceptable. And then predict population trends. And then with that, it's how do you meet that demand from that increasing population and or increased production in different segments. And so we've got to look at new sources. We've got to look at what is the consumption per person or per industry, and then associate that with a projection. And then comes the question of who pays for it. Typically it's going to be, if it's a big project, it'll be the state. Water management districts have taxing authority. St. John's is one of 5. We're kind of in the middle. We collect $82 million in tax revenue at only a third of 1 mill. Typical city would have 25 mills, for example. But when you have 5 million people in St. John's, it adds up. St. John's happens to be 18 counties from Georgia to Vero Beach. It happens to include Orlando, Ocala, Gainesville, and Jacksonville. So the plan simply gets updated every 5 years, but it's like a headlight beam. As you move forward, you keep knowing more, and so you adjust your plan. And so the plan is not self-executing. It is something that is executed largely by applicants. The stick that the district tends to have tends to be in how much you may withdraw from the ground, or how much may you withdraw from a water body, surface or otherwise. But choosing what alternatives you may choose is not our gig. You know, if there is such a thing as laissez-faire regulatory management, you know, that's kind of our theme. We can tell you what the limits are. It's up to the user to ascertain what's cost-effective for their community. St. John's happens to have like 130 utilities, you know, over 100 municipalities, and all of them have different personalities. And so that balancing act becomes interesting. They're all different flavors. All right, so now we can observe what the costs are for alternatives to groundwater. Conservation happens to be the least expensive. It's a new water ethic. It could be also appliances and things, but communities will have to think about that. Districts can't impose that. It's local ordinance. It's local leadership. It's self-regulatory management of your own industry. You know, it's the ethic of consumption. You know, that's the least expensive, and I'll show you how that fits together. Then you go to purple pipe, reuse, you know, partially treated, you know, the next least, and then you get to what's happening, which is brackish groundwater as ocean water creeps into the aquifer, and then surface water, which might be a river or obviously some other water body, and the last choice for cost is seawater. All right, that happens to be a land remembered. Everybody here read Patrick Smith's book, I bet. And you know, so Toby, what did he have? He had cows and oranges, you know, and that you're talking about Florida, and that's old Florida there. St. John's Water Management Basin from Georgia down to the headwaters of the St. John's is our district. And I show that because one of the things about what I was just speaking of, the headwaters of the district, of the river, is Blue Cypress Swamp. And that is just west of Vero Beach. And that was, in effect, northeast Everglades. I mean, it was basically a swamp. Along came canals, along came other things, you know, that drained the swamp. St. John's has recently reassembled some of the agricultural parcels and put shunts in some of those canals. And then those shunts only allow water in emergency to leave to go in the River Lagoon. The lagoon doesn't want the water because of nutrients, and it has its own issues. So we send it north up the river, you know, north up the river. I call it new water, heading towards Orlando. And then comes the question of, tell me about Orlando. Well, that is the area that we call Central Florida Water Initiative area. St. John's is the top portion. South Florida is kind of the middle that goes down, and Swift Mud's on the left. St. John's happens to have the city of Orlando, but we share the greater metropolitan area. Orlando has water constraints, and we're actively and collectively working to resolve those constraints. We've collectively tried to say that, and this is part of the scientific mandate, that the limit on groundwater is approximately 850 million gallons a day in that area. The current usage is about 800 million. All right, so it's getting close, and I'll show you how that might work. So we're thinking now about, all right, what kind of projects can be appropriate to provide alternatives to groundwater. And that could be in the form of utilizing and increased costs associated with brackish groundwater, that as it's pulled from the ground, more use of, we call it reclaimed or reuse, and that's water that comes out of the ground, is used. By the way, we don't consume water, we borrow it, and then we give it back, you know, when the tub drains or something else happens. And then it's partially treated. And it's not necessarily treated to potable drinking standards, but it's sanitized and then available to be used for irrigation, et cetera. That is efficient. It's efficient so long as it is instead of groundwater. So reusing water is definitely on the list of good things. Orlando is doing a great job of that. Other communities have more opportunity to do that. And so we are definitely talking to other communities about that opportunity. Surface water up there, St. Johns River flows nearby Orlando. Back to water that is perhaps being in the future withdrawn from the river. Our scientist's job is to know what is that amount, quantity of water that could be withdrawn without adverse consequences. The St. Johns River has 5 billion gallons a day of fresh water flow out to the ocean. 1 billion of it is from springs. And so tentatively, our scientists have said, think about 150 million as one clear availability number that does not have adverse harm, which happens to be 3% of 5 billion. And so, there's a lot of rancor about that, as if it is a massive number, but relative to the total flow, it may not be. Also, you throw in the new water that we're sending north, then it may not be, as compared to the moment, even that big. All right, so graphically, how do we go about kind of giving some method to this madness? You start with a very intense effort of saying, all right, what is that limit on groundwater? And that limit is a roll-up of all of the limiting factors that could be in the area. It's protecting lakes, it's protecting rivers, it's protecting springs, it's protecting wetlands from unacceptable harm or from significant harm. And it's a hydrological, groundwater modeling, geological, every ologist you can think of is involved in trying to create a number. And this is just a concept here, but if hypothetically this was CFWI, that number would be 850 million. The next is say, all right, what's actual right now? Well, golly, okay, it's getting close. So we got to start thinking 20 years out. And the thinking process then is this. You start with, what's the population trend? Everybody probably got an opinion, but they range. We by legislation, statute, are somewhat compelled to use what's called BEBR, Bureau of Economic Research, University of Florida numbers, and use mid-case projections. And mid-case happens to be 1.36% a year right now. I kind of think it's probably going to grow faster than that, because we're a tax haven and we had hurricanes and a lot of other reasons. But nevertheless, we use that. And so that population trend, we're 20 million people in the state now. As it trends up, those people are going to use water, borrow water. And they're going to, and so then comes at what rate per person? Fortunately, consumption per person has been declining over the last 15 years. There's been a growing awareness in conservation. There's been dynamics that have somehow, fortunately, produced a decline. Maybe it was a recession. We do impose rate structure increase, tiered rate structures on utilities where say, hey, if you're going to use a lot, you're going to pay a lot. And that microeconomic model does affect consumption. And so, that is a dynamic. But in one case, this is not, I'm not going to say which one, but if we use 2010 data on consumption per capita, the line is steeper. If we use 2012, it's less steep. And so is that a trend that would continue? Don't know. All right, so then you say, all right, well, golly, this line needs to get down to the sustainable level. What are ways to do it? All right, I'm back to my list. Conservation, there's a lot of opportunity for awareness that is not expensive, that a lot of groups wish to advocate as being the way. But they're going to need local leadership. We don't impose that. We have carrots, not sticks, on that one. And our carrots would be to incentivize projects that would lead to conservation. And so I'm personally optimistic that there will be increased conservation. Then comes, well, maybe we reuse more reuse. And we're getting close, maybe even get to where we need to be 20 years from now. But this line, all of these lines would be adjusted every 5 years by reality. Third option could be surface water if it's necessary. You know, there are a lot of constituent groups that really wish we don't use surface water. But on the other hand, you know, it's interesting to review books about western states. You know, the Colorado River hadn't made it to the Pacific Ocean in 2 years. You know, it's an aqueduct. And the aquifer out there in the desert is being depleted because there's no source to recharge it. You know, I mean, the ethic there is different than the ethic in Florida, at least by two major reasons. We're mandated to preserve Toby's Florida, you know, a land remembered. And so by doing that, then these elements kick in because sustainable groundwater is about preserving old Florida. And then, all right, what are components of old Florida? Well, springs is one of them. And springs are primarily driven by rain. I mean, the aquifer is recharged by rain. I mean, that period. And the rainfall, it's interesting to note, most of it evaporates. Another big chunk runs off. And a relatively small percentage actually percolates. And it actually matters where it rains because some areas it won't even percolate at all. You know, so rain in the right location is a big deal. But there's also an increasing reality that the straws in the ground reduce the amount of the water that can flow because it reduces the level of the aquifer somewhat. So our job is to figure out what somewhat means. And that somewhat factor is involved then in our regulatory program about what new permits can be issued for new water when there is impacts to springs, particularly springs that perhaps are not flowing as they did or should. And the flow isn't just a single number. We recognize that natural systems have a variability. Some lakes go up and down 20, 30 feet, you know, and have forever. You know, so some springs, Silver Spring's flowing right now at 700 CFS. 2 years ago, it went down to 250 during the drought. You know, everybody said, oh my God, the spring's drying up. You know, I said, on my watch, geez, please, you know, don't dry up now. And along came Tropical Storm Debbie. And within 6 weeks, it was flowing at 500. So that was kind of exhibit A for the cause and effect in substantial part. The MFLs relating to this are part of the fabric that goes into water supply planning to reaching those sustainable limits on groundwater. Water quality, largely DEP, we assist, but nutrients, phosphates, and nitrates from ag and septic tanks and from any other source you can think of that's largely, you know, civilization, contribute to the ability of algae to grow and make the spring look less attractive. And so what we're looking for now, I'm going to throw this up. These are water bodies that have constraining MFLs. All right, getting time for me to quit. All right, and these constraining MFLs then led to a interesting collaboration with the University of Florida where we have a multi-million-dollar contract of intimate scientific collaboration of understanding the hydrology of springs and may be the best in the world that's coming. And this is not just trying to create some paper, you know, that has pure science. We're looking for solutions, applied science, and with the goal to say if we're going to spend money to try to help springs, where are the hot spots? If it rains here, does the water come out, you know, more there? And just figure out the relationships. so that when a fairly limited supply of money is spent, we do the best job we can of spending it cost effectively and only spend it as necessary and as helpful. So find the hot spots, try to figure out what makes algae go away, and then make it look more attractive, right, to ag. Ag, Rich, Commissioner Putnam, we're all about carrots. We got carrots, okay? When it comes to irrigation techniques and when it comes to particularly techniques that have a dual benefit of decreasing runoff from stormwater and using tiles that both provide water for irrigation and receive water like French drains is very useful. We'll provide, say, 75%. We might even have a blue light special here soon of 90%, just to get it the prime the pump. And that is part of the future. And it's the future because underneath your farms can be cones of upper Floridan depression that can bring in salt water, which is occurring in some farm areas, in North Florida anyway. So it's in everybody's self-interest. It's also in our collective interest. And so I look forward to working with Rich and others. And Suzanne Archer, write down that phone number. She's the core program manager, and we're going to try to make it so simple that you may not even have to know government's there. I mean, we're talking about private contractors and individuals that would be your friends and neighbors assisting. We want you to help us, help you, and help Florida preserve its heritage. All right, that's it, Mike.
Thank you, Hans. Appreciate it. All this talk about water's made me thirsty. Ernie, will you want to fill me up there? Thanks.
That was only 12 minutes.
You did great. You did great. Any other comments from Rich or Ernie about some of the comments that Hans had? All right, good. Well, then we'll segue over. Rich is going to give us the lay of the land in Tallahassee, what we might expect from the 2015 legislative session, how will Amendment 1 be implemented, and protect us from the lottery ruse as far as how those funds might be shifted out of general administration funds and used that way. So it'll be very interesting to see how this shakes out.
Well, it'll certainly be interesting to see how it shakes out. In the 30 years I've been in Tallahassee, I know there's one thing you don't do, and that's try to predict what the legislature is going to do. The Amendment 1 thing I'll kind of wrap up with. I want to build on a little bit of what Hans was talking about and talk a little bit more about what we anticipate being on the table in this next session. And I want to go up even a little higher level to just talk a little bit about, Florida has a wonderful system of water governance, and it's based on a lot of sound science. It's based on a sound legislative foundation. And as Hans kind of described, it's all about, the primary goal in all of water governance is that it's the responsibility of the state and the water management districts to meet the needs of current and future reasonable and beneficial users of water and the natural system, and to try to avoid the adverse impacts of competition between users or competition between users and the environment. And if you take nothing else away from this, that is the basic foundation of Florida water law and governance. And it's all about finding that sweet spot. How do we meet the needs of current and future reasonable and beneficial users, meet the needs of the environment, and avoid the adverse impacts of competition? Well, the way to do that, and we think this is some of the things that'll come up in the session next year, is adding more meat on that basic foundation. The best way to address minimum flows and levels and the requirement for recovery or prevention strategies is to fund alternative water supply development. Alternative water supply development are those things that Hans talked about: reuse, desal, conservation, surface water storage, aquifer recharge. Those kinds of projects are going to take the stress off of the natural system by providing alternative sources of water for those reasonable and beneficial users. So it all kind of knits together. A lot of folks talk about we're not funding enough natural resource preservation or conservation programs, but by definition, if you're generating alternative sources of water for users to use now and in the future, you are generating a resource recovery and conservation plan because you're taking the pressure off of that natural system by providing those alternative sources. So there's going to be, I think you'll see legislation that tries to create more funding pressure on the districts and the state to accelerate MFL's development through the funding of aggressive alternative water supply projects. I think there'll be language, there will be an effort to reinforce and build that foundation a little stronger coming forward. I can't be specific on what it'll look like because I don't know, but it's a big component of what you've heard my boss, Commissioner Putnam, talk about. That is his way of growing the water pie, making more water available for current and future users, is through funding alternative water supply projects. Conservation is one of those, and we're committed to that through the cost share programs and the incentive programs that we participate in with all the water management districts, and leverage a lot of federal money too. So it's a partnership together to work through. So alternative water supply funding, trying to accelerate minimum flows and levels, trying to figure out ways to protect legal existing users, those people and entities and counties and businesses that have water use permits. How can we protect their ability to rely on that permit while at the same time meeting the needs of the environment and building some reserve to allow for future growth? That's the thrust of what I think you'll see in the legislature this next year. There'll be a Springs bill, almost without question. There was a huge effort in the Senate to pass a comprehensive Springs bill last year. I think what you'll see is going to be much more moderate, mainstream, not mandating that counties do this and that utilities do that with an open checkbook. So there will be, I believe, though, a Springs bill moving forward. And then there will definitely be a comprehensive attempt to implement Amendment 1. And believe me, that is not going to be an easy task. The way the amendment is worded will mandate that the Land Acquisition Trust Fund, the statute upon which our acquisition programs have been based in the past, will largely have to be rewritten. All of the dock stamp distribution components in Chapter 120, very complicated formula that is the formula now that distributes dock stamps to at least 8, maybe more, environmental restoration programs now. That statute is going to have to be revamped to account for this mandatory 30% into the Land Acquisition Trust Fund that Amendment 1 mandates, and then how that money is distributed. Kind of the uncertainty in all of this is that I think those who crafted the amendment and were heavily behind it, it's one of those situations where you have to be careful what you ask for. There were a lot of general funds in these environmental programs that had been allocated by the legislature in prior years. It wasn't just limited to dock stamps. And there's a lot of debt surface that these dock stamp revenues are going to have to be, allocated to from past purchases. And, the legislature, none of the legislators that I know of were in favor of Amendment 1. They all despised the fact that it was writing the budget into our Constitution. That's really their job. That's why we hire them. That's the only thing they're required to do every year is pass a budget. And now we've taken 30%, 33% of their dock stamp revenue off the table, essentially. The point that I'm trying to make is you may end up with 33% of the dock stamp revenue and nothing else. You could actually see a decrease in funding for environmental restoration programs due to the Amendment 1 process, because the legislature may say, okay, you wanted 33%, you're going to get 33%. That's all you're going to get. So those are, and hey, your guess is as good as mine how they're going to divide that apple. But I'm just, saying that is a potential outcome is that we end up with just 33% dock stamp revenues in environmental restoration programs. It's also a very, very broadly worded amendment. I think, and I think both of the gentlemen sitting next to me up here would agree, that the language that talks about restoring natural systems towards the very end of the language could easily be used to fund alternative water supply projects, because that's what you're doing. When you're identifying or developing alternative water supply projects, you are, by definition, by removing that competition, that pressure on the resource, you're restoring or contributing to the restoration of that natural system. So it, in all likelihood, won't all go to land purchases or land management. We think a good bit of it could potentially be used as a source of funding for alternative water supplies. The other thing to keep in mind is it's not any new money. It's the same dock stamp monies that have been collected every year. It's just telling the legislature how they have to kind of reserve this 33% for this broadly worded amendment. It's not any new taxes. It's not any new revenue. It's just going to pull money away from other programs where they may have gone in the past. I'll end there.
Thank you, Rich. Any comments, Hans or Ernie?
That was a great summary. And if anybody, Ernie or anyone has any further insight, but the chance that in the aggregate, the total funding could be the same or even theoretically decrease is interesting. I mean, it's sort of like, I've been married to my wife for 40 years, and we say, well, honey, your salary, we're going to use it to pay the mortgage, when before we used our joint money. I mean, it's the same money.
Yeah.
And same obligations. And so, to be determined how that plays out. One other point, since we have a lot of ag in here, is don't be afraid to get a CUP, a consumptive use permit. Some farmers are reluctant to do business with the government, but there may be a day where you wish you had it. So I'm not looking for business, but we process 350 cups in about 3,000 ERPs, and cups are there to assure your use for the period permitted, which make up a time, 20 years, for reasonable beneficial use. Cups are your friend.
That's interesting, your analogy to your marital situation, because in my family, what's hers is hers and what's mine is hers. Okay, Ernie's going to clean up for us. And one of the things I failed to mention is that Ernie's also director in the Water and Land Advisory environmental consulting firm that assists a number of landowners who address a number of the issues we're talking about. And Ernie's topic is going to be, basically how are we replumbing our water management districts and addressing the issues having to do with the Kissimmee River Basin, the estuaries, and also opportunities for the private landowners with dispersed water, payment for environmental services. Ernie?
Thank you, Michael. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today. I in his previous introduction of all of us, my background, I spent 30 years in government, all in the environmental arena and working at either the state level or at the water management districts. And one of the things I learned, you interact with your constituents over the years, environmental groups, local governments, landowners, agricultural business, industry. And, one of the things I found over and over again, it was always such a pleasure to interact with agriculture. One of the things you learn is private landowners in particular are by far, they have instilled in them this ethic of stewardship. Their land is their livelihood, their ability to produce is essential to the economy, and their ability to pass that on for generations is just ingrained in their fabric. And when I left government, the opportunity to go to work for industry and the agricultural industry, in particular the Florida Land Council, has been just one of the most rewarding things in my life, and it is equaled, the honor that I had serving as a public servant all those years. And just wanted to lead off with that. You'll pick up in my comments, although I am from government, as a retired 30-year veteran of government, I'm also a very strong advocate for private landowners, and in particular private landowners being part of voluntarily being part of large-scale solutions to deal with complex environmental problems. And so to sort of tee that up, I wanted to use a real-life example, and I was honored that Michael asked me to cover this topic. What happened was, the state of Florida was a swamp, as Hans said. It was, the land remembered. Everything pretty much south of Orlando was a wetland. The only thing that was dry was the coastal ridges on the sides and the Ocala Ridge or the Lake Wells Ridge, where the old sand hills run down the middle of the state. And in 1926, we had hurricanes, resulted in, you'll see the bottom, the top map, we lost 2,000 lives due to the breaching of Lake Okeechobee overflowed, and sadly, it's the second most deadliest loss of life from a natural event in the United States history, second only to the Galveston hurricanes in the turn of the last century. In 1947, another hurricane came through, and you see the bottom map. Essentially, everything went underwater. And that led to Congress coming in and authorizing the Central and South Florida Flood Control Project. And that ended up being this massive effort to replumb South Florida and reclaim land, reclaim the wetlands and drain them and turn that into land that could be developed for both agriculture and people to move into. And that was authorized in 1948. So everything pretty much south of here is part of this massive flood control project that worked very, very well. And it allowed the construction of over 2,000 miles of canals, 2,800 miles of levees. There's over 600 water control structures. And day to day, people don't think about it. As you drive down the Turnpike or I-95, and most people, there's 7.5 million people living in South Florida, don't realize when they drive into their own neighborhoods, this used to be a wetland. And if not for this flood control system, they wouldn't be able to function. So 7.7 million people now live here. And if you do the math, in the state of Florida, there was 1 million people in 1920. As Hans mentioned, there's 20 million people today. That's an average of 586 people net population gain per day. And that has continued and been pretty sustaining. We've had some years in the 2000s where over 700 per day net population growth. And if you put it in that context, that's a lot of pressure on our water resources and our ability to provide flood protection. But it also, this flood control system allowed for 3 million acres of agriculture to move in. We have a very diverse agricultural industry in Florida, from cattle to citrus to sugarcane to sod to tropical fruits and vegetables, tomatoes, winter vegetables. And this is the second to only tourism, the most important part of our economy here in Florida is this ability to sustain this agricultural operation. And of course, Florida does balance all that with this overwhelming commitment to protect our natural areas. Central to managing all this water in South Florida is Lake Okeechobee. It's the second largest freshwater lake wholly in the United States. It is complicated, though, because there's a 5,000 square mile watershed trying to drain into a 7,300 square mile lake. What that ends up meaning is water can enter into the lake in the wet season a lot faster than it can drain out. When we had those floods, those hurricanes came, they put a levee, 30-foot high, about a football field wide, 140-mile long levee completely encircles the lake. So the lake no longer flows out into the floodplain and contracts like a normal lake does. It rises and falls like a bathtub. When the lake gets too high, there's too much pressure on the levee might break, property loss, and damages might happen. So the Army Corps of Engineers, when the lake starts rising, feels compelled to drain the water out very, very rapidly. So the restoration of that levee is very, very important to the future of South Florida. But here's what these modifications have all resulted into. The map on the left is how water used to flow. Water would come down the Kissimmee chain of lakes, fill up the lake, spill over the south end, and then slowly make its way down through the Everglades and into Florida Bay. What you'll notice on the map on the left is there's no connection to the Caloosahatchee River or the St. Lucie River, east or west. Those were some of the initial canals that were dug when they built the early portions of the flood control system in South Florida. The map on the right is what currently happens. When the lake starts to fill up, over 60% of the water is shunted east and west to the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie estuaries. Even if it's good, pure, clean water, too much water at the wrong time in the wrong place kills the oysters, the seagrasses, and the fish that those estuaries need to, that support. And what you'll notice is about 19% is used for agriculture and other purposes, and only about 19–20% of the water even makes it down into the Everglades anymore. We've completely dismantled the natural flow of water of in a very significant portion of our state. So the unintended ecological context is this water. This is a picture of the St. Lucie estuary. It's usually very clear, ocean water brought into the tides, very very healthy estuary. And when the lake's releasing, it just gets overrun with a highly turbid and higher nutrient-laden water comes down. Same thing, and this is the plume that extends way out into the Atlantic Ocean when the Army Corps is releasing those flows. And algal blooms take place. We see massive harm to the estuaries. So what are some of the long-term solutions? They're trying to replumb the system, capture some of that excess water. It's roughly about 1.7 billion gallons a day on average of too much water gets dumped into the estuaries. To capture that water somehow, store it on the land, and then reintroduce it into the system during the dry season. That's the other thing. The farther south you go, there's a more pronounced wet and dry season. So we get a lot of rain in South Florida, but it mostly happens during the rainy season, and we need that water during the dry season. So how can we capture it, build reservoirs, and put it back into the system? And so there's a lot of public works being proposed, and that will take care of some of the problem. But I think, and what you're seeing is this recognition of you can't just keep buying land, taking valuable agricultural land out of production to build these large 10, 20,000 acre reservoirs. And so there's opportunities for private landowners to come in to the picture. In 2007, the legislature passed the Northern Everglades Protection Act. And since that has been done, we've been able to partner and store over 60,000 acre feet of water, working with private landowners. And in addition to that, we're also constructing the public works to store water on more of a government-owned facility approach. So with that, let me kind of focus in on the dispersed water management aspect of this. Essentially what it is to use existing agricultural activities. We had the most success with ranchers, where through cattle rotation and different things, you could actually take portions of your property, put in some boards, hold back water in your ag ditches, instead of draining that landscape, having it get collected in the canals and then flow into the lake and the lake fill up, hold some of that back. And that helps alleviate and take some of the pressure off these discharges during the high water stage efforts. We started with the FRES program, and this shows you a simple kind of way to help solve the problem. Well, how does it benefit? Well, the water resource benefits are very evident. You're increasing water storage throughout the entire system, so there's less water that goes into the lake and ultimately into the estuaries. By holding that water back and letting it percolate into the ground and uptake by your grasses and your pastures and everything else, you're reducing nutrient loading. You're recharging the groundwater, so a future water user might be able to pull it out in the dry season for irrigation. Wetland habitats are created, and there's habitat improvement, and you can do this pretty quickly. These aren't highly engineered systems. Economic benefits: you don't have to buy the land; it stays on the tax rolls. It keeps the working landscape, so there doesn't negatively affect jobs. And it also, agriculture remains sustainable, so you don't have conversion to higher, more intense uses of land. So we have basically 4 different types of these programs that have been implemented. Doing it on the initial private projects that I'll talk about very briefly. We're also taking that same concept, the the government has bought a lot of the land over the years to build these reservoirs and doesn't have enough money to construct them yet. So let's put them into a dispersed water management program in this sort of intervening period of time until we get enough funds to actually construct the facilities. We're doing water farming, which is just a little more intense application of what we've learned before. And then how we pay for that through these environmental services. So the initial projects, we did 7. There's 5 of them operational, and they've been able to store about 10,000 acre feet of water. On the public lands, these are to take the lands that we've already purchased for other purposes, and then do the minor construction features to actually hold the water back. And to date, the district had done about 12 of those and have stored about 2,500 acre feet. The water farming is taking what the little subtlety in the initial projects we did. We worked primarily with ranchers who have larger landscapes to work with. They can do move cattle around, so they can flood one area and move the cattle to the other. We also wanted to try this with other sectors, so we call it water farming, but it's essentially doing the same thing, but with the citrus industry. Most of the citrus industry in along the Indian River area has a lot more perimeter berming and deeper ditches, so we think we can actually store more water than just flooding a pasture. We can actually fill up to the beds in most cases, so you can actually store a little bit more water. But the difference is you lose your flexibility. You're going to lose your trees. You're not going to be able to do it the same way as with cattle operations. So the real question here is it viable financially? So we tried a pilot project, and we have 3 of those now underway. They all became operational in 2014, and this was also augmented by some federal money that the Department of Environmental Protection was able to get into place. And then, so just to sort of wrap up, essentially what the concept is that for an up to a 10-year period of time, the landowner enters into an agreement with the water management district. They calculate how much water they'll be able to store, and on a per acre foot of storage, make an annual payment. The construction cost, if you have to put up any additional, boards or minor levees or construct any sort of impoundments or any sort of pumps that have to be built, those construction costs are paid up front, and then a per acre foot of storage is paid on an annual basis going forward. I think as a combination, they ultimately hope to, they will by the end of this year have about 86,000 acre feet online and in place. We need about 1 million acre feet throughout the system, a combination of the infrastructure built by the agencies plus this. So, if I think a realistic target, if you could get about 200,000 or 300,000 acre feet enrolled in this type of program, supplemented with the public works, I think ultimately we could go a long way toward eliminating or reducing the catastrophic freshwater releases to the estuaries. I don't think we'll ever eliminate them, but we can reduce the frequency of it and better manage system in Florida. And the thing that I just wanted to bring to you, to kind of close, matches my opening statements. I think this approach gives you an opportunity to continue to have viable agricultural operations on property, and then also grow water, and then be part of a regional solution that helps the entire area, because your benefits would extend far beyond the boundaries of your property, and even in your home county, you'll see benefits downstream and upstream by putting back in some additional flexibility into the water management system that's currently in place in South Florida. This is the Water Management District's website. If you go there, you can learn about all their individual projects they have in place, how much they're paying per acre foot, and those types of things. In addition, when they do additional solicitations for projects, you'll be able to work directly with them in putting together a proposal to be very tailored specific to your piece of property. This is a program that's been recognized by the legislature. This past year, they put $10 million towards this project in state appropriations. I anticipate as other water management districts begin to implement this practice, it will extend beyond just the South Florida boundary, and I think you'll see the legislature going forward put additional funds towards this. And with that, be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Ernie. Well, you opened a door there. Maybe we can let Hans make a comment. You see this as a concept that will find its way up to St. John's and into the other districts?
Definitely a concept of restoring the natural systems that once existed. The aspect of it that I keep wrestling with is what is the lack of permanence. It is somewhat temporary, but could be a bridge to a more permanent solution. And so, if Ernie could comment on what those more permanent solutions might be that is part of the equation. But because we're all about, the St. John's as South Florida, and Indian River Lagoon has got a situation right now. And the situation in large part is these releases. And so anything that abates these releases, you can put in favor of box. But that's my initial comment.
I would just offer that we all know that as we go through our respective responsibilities in the water resource protection and restoration, the science changes, and our assessment of water bodies, how they behave and what they respond to, and what are the best technologies and techniques to implement to restore them or protect them change over time. This kind of a program, to me, gives us that kind of a little bit of flexibility in the overall menu of things that we implement. I mean, TMDLs aren't permanent. You think about that's a total maximum daily load. I think most of the audience has heard about what they are. We've got one for the lake that's 140 metric tons. That could change over time. It may go down. It may go up. And these kinds of programs that aren't permanent and don't take land off the tax rolls and are actually, I think, an interesting tool because they can be brought into effect and be phased out depending upon how things change looking forward. So just another way of looking at it.
And the attractiveness to a lot of the citrus industry, who's we all know are having to deal with the issues with greening and everything else, is the fact that it could be an interim use while we're waiting for IFAS and others to come forward with the silver bullet that helps us with greening. Ernie, when someone goes through that, though, I mean, they've got to be concerned about, are they going to be able to recover their property at the back end of this and be able to use it in another form of agriculture? Maybe you want to mention that briefly.
Yeah, there's two kind of well, first of all, the way the agreements are structured is they're annual payments and they're subject to funding. So if the state appropriation or the water management district is not capable of providing the next year's payment, there is a way they can break the contract. But generally, the district has tried to make sure they have enough money in reserves up front to honor the duration of the contract. The second piece,
Let's keep the federal government out of that part of it.
The second piece, though, is the regulatory concerns. You are taking land that used to be a wetland, probably, because most of South Florida used to flood or used to get wet at times. It may not be definitional a wetland, but you're now permanently hydrating it for longer periods of time. So what happens, as a biologist, I understand, wetland species move in, and now you have created a wetland on your property that you may post-drain it, be regulated for wetlands. So in order to protect against that, 2 years ago, the state legislature passed a law that said if you participate in one of these projects, what you do when you go get your permit is you do a wetland delineation and you delineate where all the wetlands currently are on your property, and you establish a baseline, and then once you flood it, if you create additional wetlands beyond that, which you will, they're not jurisdictional. So once you drain it, you can go back to your previous wetland boundaries. That is only binding to the state. You then have the Army Corps of Engineers and their 404 wetland permitting. They have, through agreement with the state, have honored that so far. So they've been also doing the same. They entered into an agreement with the South Florida Water Management District. It would need to be transferred to the other districts as they go forward. So I think from a wetland perspective, you would be protected. What you already have as a liability to protect wetlands on your property wouldn't expand. But the second piece is endangered species. You may have a migratory bird that's protected that come in, or a rookery of wood storks that are protected move into your property. And we've been working real closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they've been surprisingly receptive to the concept of developing some sort of safe harbor agreement, either with the state or with the Water Management District, or even down to individual landowners who participate in that. And what the safe harbor agreement would be is that you would demonstrate that for the period of time that you're operating, flooding your land, there is a benefit that wouldn't have been there unless you had done that, and you wouldn't be held accountable for any new protected species that move onto your property. But that's in the negotiation stage, and that needs a lot of work. So we'll continue to work toward that.
And of course, those of us that are afflicted with law degrees are always worried about the fact that is a federal judge somewhere going to have a different opinion than the agency had. So that's an issue we still have to work through. Okay, so Mike, you want to lead off with the first question?
Just share briefly how the greenbelt designation might play into those specific properties, both in the short and long term.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Because we've had the legislation that went through this past year on that,
Yeah.
that we helped draft. But
Everybody understands that.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
sure. All right. Well, Dennis and I worked with our representatives and our folks at DAX to make sure that just because you have gone into a water farming activity, you won't lose your greenbelt designation. The concern was that you might be determined to be in some other form of industrial activity that would allow the property appraiser to declassify you as ag exempt and then revalue you based on some other type of mechanism. So we were able to, with the help of the legislature, craft language that would, so long as you meet the requirement of what's being converted for a water farming activity, having lost the property due to greening or some other activity from an agricultural endeavor into the water farming, you'll be able to maintain that ag exemption going forward. Other questions for our panel? We have a great panel up here. We'll start up here and then work our way back. So, yes, ma'am.
Rich, I just wanted to ask you for clarification.
Sure.
One of the things you said that they would probably look to protect legal existing users to rely on their CUPs. So some of the things we're hearing throughout the state is that we have producers doing their best to conserve water, and then all of a sudden they conserve water and their CUP gets reduced, and that's not protecting them.
Right, and I don't think any of the districts are doing that now as a reason to open up the permit. If you're implementing conservation practices that result in a 10 or 20 or 30% reduction in your consumptive use permit quantity, in my experience, the districts are no longer, they may have in the past, but I think there's a general understanding that that's a disincentive to conserve. So they're not using that as justification to open up with a permit. Now, at the permit renewal point, there may be an adjustment in the allocation to reflect that conservation. Because, the game is up on your existing permit at the point of renewal, and you have to come in and, re-justify what you need. And so if you have, particularly if the conservation that you've achieved is the result of cost share that's come from the state, then it is likely to impact your total allocation at the point of renewal, just to lock in that conservation benefit associated with the cost share payment.
Of course, what would be interesting would be the ability to possibly monetize that additional allocation that you might be able to transfer to someone else who's in need of allocation, which would then create an incentive for the permit holder to.
Right, but it would not have the benefit of the resource restoration
Correct.
aspect of it. So you just have to, we struggle with that, how we would.
Any other
figure that
comments
out.
on that question before we take another question?
No, generally endorse what Rich summarized. I mean, yeah, we don't want to disincentivize, the, in effect, creation of water through a conservation event. I mean, and so that's not a formal rule, but it's just good judgment. And so we're trying to be in the good judgment business.
Dennis, real quick.
I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I think Ernie's probably the one who would have this information. Can you give an idea or perspective as to just how much water Florida dumps to tide in the course of a month?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just in South Florida alone, it's 2 million acre feet. When you calculate that in gallons, it's about 1.7 billion gallons per day. Now, it doesn't happen every single day, so there's days when there's, 3 or 4 billion gallons going out, which is all wasteful water that didn't go that way. It's simple math, though. I mean, we had 4 million acres of Everglades pre-construction of the system, and now we have 2 million acres. So the same amount of rainfall falls in the system, so we have half the area that used to just be wet and soak up the land. But it's a lot. It's 1.7 billion gallons per day of excess flows, and that's what we need to capture, at least half of that to make the system more healthy.
Yeah, and as Hans noted in his presentation, the upper basin of the St. Johns River actually reaches all the way into northern St. Lucie County with the Fort Drum Marsh, and we discharge a lot of water out through our sea canal systems in the Treasure Coast that would have naturally gone into the St. Johns but for the turnpike and the canal. So hopefully we can do some effort to replumb that. Next question?
For this private land water storage, is there a potential benefit for the landowner when they can use some storage water like a lake recreationally, stock it with fish or, boating or something?
They're usually not that big.
Yeah.
They're pretty small. Most of these are small and shallow. They do augment certainly local pasture health. Because as Ernie mentioned, it raises the groundwater table locally around there. The grasses on these sites typically overwinter much better when they do drain and dry back out. The landowners are able to graze them when they're dry. They don't have to write off the land that's the footprint of whatever storage feature. They're able to use it. They get paid whether they store the water or not. If it's a dry year and there is no excess water to store, they're still going to get the payment. It's an option, so it's a predictable income. To me, that's the biggest benefit. It's the most predictable source of income I think an agricultural producer could ever hope to get, is an annual payment on X number of acre feet of water stored, even if he doesn't store it, because Mother Nature doesn't cooperate.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add to that is that one of the government side would criticize the program because what you're doing, what Rich just said, and we may go into a 2 or 3 year drought and there's no, you don't flood your property, why should you still get paid? Well, you've made some business decisions to enter into those agreements that you could have had 3 years where you were flooded and may not have had full use of the property. But the second piece, to me, it's more like you pay for your fire department because when you have a fire, you better have somebody to come put the fire out. To me, you pay to have the ability to store the water because when you need to store water, you should have a place to store it. So I think you can make the argument, if you want this to be economically viable and a good business decision for a landowner to partner with government, you have to have a system set up to where you make the payments annually. And if you use it every single year, you use it every year. If you use it 5 out of the 10 years, you use it 5 out of the 10 years. But you have that ability to do that.
Yes?
This may be my old tax lawyer juices going, Mike, but the concept of private donations for a charitable contribution of conservation easements. If you have a patriarch who's getting up in years, you've got a use they want to make of it that doesn't fit the exact model for what the district can provide, but they promise to do something with it that has this environmental lift. That conceivably could qualify for an income tax deduction as a charitable contribution and lower estate taxes.
Correct.
And you could deal with a private land trust.
Yeah.
And so, we could get involved in certifying the validity of the charitable assumption.
Certainly.
But I just...
There is certainly a planning opportunity with that, and there's also the opportunity down the road because you're doing water quality improvements as well, that as we get serious about water quality credits and helping other communities meet their water quality needs, this could be another revenue stream for agriculture as well.
What is the construction projects on US 27 south of South Bay on the, south side? There's a big area of limestone that's been moved and dug up. Is that something with water?
It does. That's a 14,000 acre flow equalization basin. It's it's an above ground impoundment, very large in size. It's the same size as the island of Manhattan, to put it in perspective. And what it does is it captures water that flows out of the Everglades agricultural area, stores it, and then flows it through stormwater treatment areas before it goes into the Everglades.
Just cost a little bit more than trinkets and beads.
Yeah, that's about a full cost, probably about a $400 million project, fully paid for.
One last question. I live in Miami-Dade. It seems like the construction of high-rise condos is endless. Is the water supply need to be endless for all that as well?
Well, it's the most productive aquifer in the world.
Yeah, they use the Biscayne aquifer. There is a regional availability rule in South Florida that there is no more groundwater. I mean, they're kind of capped at the groundwater level. But as we restore the Everglades and flow through the Everglades, the water rapidly leaks out, so there is more capacity being generated through Everglades restoration. The other key piece, Hans mentioned reuse. There's about 300 million gallons per day of ocean outfalls, where they're dumping water out into the Atlantic Ocean from the wastewater treatment plants. They have a 60% recovery target they have to do. That brings a lot of that water back into the system. That's not the water you'll be drinking. That's the water that'll be irrigating lawns and golf courses. So they're no longer pulling groundwater out, freeing up the groundwater for drinking water. So the Miami-Dade's in pretty good shape for the next 20 years, primarily because they're implementing those very extensive ocean outfall reclamation projects.
And that was a key component to CERP, the Everglades restoration, that it was going to provide water supply for South Florida. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the 850 million or for the Orlando. What happens when they hit that?
Well,
And what he forgot to say,
yeah.
they've already permitted over $1 billion. So
Yeah, I mean, we're all about accelerating a plan for recovery of that deficit. And it'll have many components, but the way you deal with those situations is have a prevention recovery strategy that includes components of creation of alternative water supplies, perhaps conservation, and just basically get ahead of that curve, build the rainbow that I talked about, you know, and that 20-year rainbow is a plan that can recover, you know. So one good thing about Florida is that we do plan. You know, I tell economic development people that if they're talking to a business prospect looking at another state, that that other state doesn't plan probably. And he should come to Florida, because we will have water for all reasonable beneficial uses, you know. And so we're fairly unique in our legal structure in that there are not vested water rights here. No one owns water in Florida. It's a state owns the water other than some wastewater. And so we've got the ability to plan and to reallocate and to adjust. And that's what makes the opportunity complicated and hopefully satisfying.
I'm being told we need to wrap it up. Again, thank you all for participating. It's been a great presentation. Rich, please go back and tell the commissioner thank you for sponsoring this program. We would love to continue to do it, and we'd love to continue to have the support of FDACS for doing it. So thank you all. Appreciate it.